If you've recently got yourself a VermiHut worm tower for your worms and you're trying to find out how to set it up and what are the little tricks and secrets about keeping one and how to maintain it and all that stuff, we have for you in this video, and we're going to get into it right now. So starting it off, there's a lot of different worm bins out there that you can get, and it's not one that I would personally recommend unless you are someone that doesn't have a lot of extra space for a worm bin, or if you're maybe in an apartment or somewhere with just a small balcony. This would be a great worm bin for you because it's not going to take up a large footprint, and it would be great if you have a few outdoor plants and you just need a small amount of castings for maybe 5 to 10 plants. This would be great for you. So starting it out, we are going to fill it with worm bedding or peat moss, which is what we recommend, and just want to take your time and make sure the peat moss doesn't have a lot of huge clumps in it, because the worms aren't going to be able to eat through the bedding and then from the food scraps to turn it to castings if there's big clumps. And also the worms breathe through their skin, so if the worm's wiggling around through there and he hits a big clump, he's not going to be able to move through it, and also it's not going to be filled with moisture. So we want to take our time and break up all the big pieces, and also make sure that it's nice and mixed up with water. That way, when the worms do go through it, they'll be moving smoothly. So the chickens had to come and make sure we didn't have any treats for them, and so they were making sure we set it up good as well. So we appreciate the chickens' help. So anyway, when you're setting up your bin, you also need to have it in a nice shaded location. That way the worms don't overheat, and they can overheat over 90 degrees or get too cold below 30. So once you have your bedding in the first tier of the tower, you can then stop right there and add your worms, but we recommend to just go ahead and set it up and to put your worms in at the top and let them dive down through all the towers. And we're also mixing it up in the tower, and as you go, the water will seep through the layers down to the bottom. And we always recommend to get your worm tower set up about a week ahead to get the microbes going in the worm bin and to make sure it's not a sterile environment for the worms. So another thing to think about when you're setting up your bin, if you are reading through the instructions, it'll tell you to do them one at a time and gradually increase your trays. But we've found that if you just stack them all up, the worms will eventually go through the top and bottom. Now it might take a month or two to get them in the bottom tray and all the way to the top tray, but eventually they'll work their way down through there. But for the most part, as long as you are feeding the top tray, they're probably just going to stay in the top tray. So try not to overthink it, and the main goal of raising worms is to get to worm castings. And so if your goal is to have worm castings and you start with just one tray, you're only going to get the one tray of castings, whereas if you just started them all, you're going to be getting your way there to castings faster, and the worms will go to where they feel comfortable in the tower. So maybe you guys can let me know in the comments down below, but I feel like this is a good way for beginners to get started without a lot of effort. And because if you do the stackable, you're going to get into is it time for the second tray and all that stuff, and you really should just be focusing on what you're feeding them and to try to keep them healthy and not really worried about when's the time to add a tray. So with all that being said, the VermiHut is a very good starter bin for new people, or if you have if you don't have a lot of free space where you're going to be composting. But other than that, we do recommend, if you have the space, building a wooden bin and doing a larger amount of worms, whereas you would get you could do a pound of worms to 4 pounds of worms in a VermiHut is what I would recommend. At least a pound, whereas if you got a bigger bin, kind of like the ones we show in our other videos, you could be getting 20 to 40 pounds in a bin, and it just depends on how many castings you need for the year and how big of a garden you have, etc. So, but we do believe at Harley's Worms you can never have enough worm castings or worms, so choice is yours. But if you are looking for worm bins, this is the best worm tower we've personally used, so it is a decent recommendation from us, but this isn't a sponsored video or a paid partnership. It's just something we thought would be good to share for somebody limited on space. So with all that being said, once you get all the bins filled up with moist peat moss, you're then going to want to put out some worm chow if you don't have any food scraps. So we put the worm chow, and that makes sure that the worms have plenty of food, and we like to do 1 to 3 days worth of food. So if you're brand new at this, just start with a smaller amount than this, and once you get to where it lasts 3 to 4 days, keep feeding that amount until it takes more food than that. So you don't want to let your worms run out of food, but at the same time you don't want to overfeed them, and that actually causes the bin to overheat. So be careful with that in the summertime. And you also need to add grit for your worms. So we add oyster shell flour, and this balances the pH of the peat moss because it's naturally acidic. So then when you put the oyster shell, you're also giving a calcium source for your worms so that they can be healthy. And so then before you add the worms, I would wait a week, and then you would be at this step to add your worms. And now this is not exactly a pound of worms, but this would be a good time to add your pound to 4 pounds of worms. And I wouldn't try to spread them out to make them dive down. I would just let them dive down naturally. And so your worms might not exactly look as hydrated as this because these were left over from a shipment, whereas your worms, if you ordered them from us, they would be a little bit dehydrated. So you would want to have a water source available to moisturize them and bring them back to a nice damp condition, and that way you know your worms will be okay for the next day. So hit them with a good mist of water, and you can kind of tell when they have enough moisture, the water will pull up a little bit at the top, but you can overwater the worms. So just keep your eye on it, and it should be fine. And as long as the worms have food and water and they don't, like I said, go too extreme in the temperatures, you'll be doing great. And then we add a little bit of molasses to really boost the microbes even more. And this isn't necessary, but it is something that will help your worm bin, especially when it's brand new. And so once you do all that, you could hit it with a little bit of more water to kind of dilute the molasses. And so then you're ready for the lid. And before you put the lid, we also put in a worm blanket, which we are now going to sell on our website, and then also with a worm pillow, which is the silver thing. So you can get your worms a blanket and a pillow to be comfortable no matter what the temperatures. But the pillow, the silver blanket, you'd actually take off since it's the summertime and save it for when the temperatures get cold. And then you would do the blanket with the pillow for your worms to be living in pure luxury. And with the blanket and the pillow, with worm chow and oyster shell flour and a premium grit, you should have no problems really multiplying your worms and getting them to a great bend that looks good, and the castings really perform to grow the plants. So with all that said, thank you guys, legends, for staying till the end, and check out our website at harleysworms.com. Thank you. Love you guys.